People think that Johnny Carson is one of the most famous TV hosts and that he gets along with almost everyone. Even though he was friendly and ready to be open with others, his guests sometimes made him mad. And these are the famous people that Bob Hope Johnny Carson hated having on his show. Even though Johnny Carson and Bob Hope were two of the most famous comedians of all time, their friendship at work was not at all friendly. Carson, who was famous for being able to interview people easily and start interesting conversations on the spot, apparently didn't like having Bob Hope on The Tonight Show. Why? Hope's rigid scripted style didn't work with Carson's taste for natural, unstructured conversations. This led to some of the most forced interviews in the history of The Tonight Show. Even though Bob Hope was a famous comic, he was getting old and relied on prepared jokes and cue cards by the time he was a regular guest on Tonight. Hope liked to say one-liners that he had practiced, often hoping that Carson would set him up for a joke. This was different from most of the other guests who talked with Carson naturally. This made the interviews feel less like conversations and more like a scripted comedy show, which Carson allegedly found boring and dulling. Another big reason was that Hope wasn't very good at starting conversations. Carson liked things to be spontaneous, but with Hope the conversations were always the same and easy to guess. Hope's team would often send the makers of Tonight Show a list of topics and jokes that were already written. This made Carson more of a prop than an interviewer. Carson was annoyed by this lack of real contact. He once said that interviewing Hope was like talking to a big advertising machine. Hope was also a Hollywood star, so The Tonight Show often felt like they had to book him even if he didn't have anything new or interesting to talk about. Hope's visits were often tied to whatever new show or project he was working on, which made them feel like glorified ads. Other guests came to entertain or share personal stories. Joan Rivers. Johnny Carson and Joan Rivers had a difficult relationship that went from being friends and teachers to being very angry with each other. Many years ago, Carson loved having Rivers on The Tonight Show as a guest. He thought she was funny, witty, and good at sharp chatter, so he often had her on the show as a guest host. But things went badly between them at work in 1986, and Carson came to dislike Rivers so much that he banned her from his show for good. Carson was Rivers' first supporter and gave her one of her big breaks on national TV in 1965. She quickly became a regular, and in the early 1980s she was even Carson's usual guest host. Many people thought this meant she was being trained to take over as his replacement, but Carson allegedly found Rivers hard to handle at times, even though they got along well on air. She was known for being rude and making mean jokes, which didn't always go well with Carson's more calm and collected way of hosting. Carson didn't hate having Rivers on his show because she was funny. He didn't like it because he felt deeply betrayed by her. Rivers became the first woman to have her own late-night talk show when she agreed to lead the Joan Rivers Late Night Show on Fox in 1986. But she didn't tell Carson in person before the deal was made public. Carson was shocked and greatly hurt by her move, which she saw as an act of betrayal. Rivers tried to call him to explain, but he wouldn't answer. They never talked again. Because of this, Carson banned Rivers from The Tonight Show, and that choice stayed in place for almost 30 years. Carson left, but his replacement, Jay Leno, kept the ban in place out of respect for Carson. Rivers didn't go back to The Tonight Show until Jimmy Fallon took over in February 2014. Steve Wayne. Johnny Carson and Wayne Newton had one of the most famous fights in the history of late-night TV. Carson was known for his quick wit and funny jabs at famous people, but his repeated jokes about Newton caused a lot of trouble and ended with a personal encounter that Carson felt very uncomfortable with. Carson often made fun of Newton on The Tonight Show, focusing on the singer's flashy style, over-the-top acts, and what he saw as her lack of masculinity. Carson's jokes often made fun of Newton's high voice and polished look as a Vegas showman, suggesting that he wasn't as tough or manly as other entertainers. A lot of famous people laughed off Carson's jabs, but Newton took them personally. He was proud of his accomplishments and didn't like being made fun of all the time. When Newton chose to talk to Carson directly, the tension reached a breaking point. It was well known that Newton had a lot of connections in Las Vegas, so he didn't just ignore what Carson said. He allegedly barged into Carson's office, threatened to hurt him, and told him to stop making fun of people. Some people say that Newton's meaning was clear. Things would go wrong if the jokes didn't stop. It was said that Carson, who was known for running his show well and never backing down from a joke, was upset by what happened. People didn't usually get into physical fights, and Newton's aggressive behavior made an impact that will last. Carson stopped making jokes about Newton after what happened, but the damage to their friendship was already done. It was said that Carson didn't like having Newton as a guest because of this past. Even though he was professional on radio, he probably felt uncomfortable being around Newton because he knew there was tension between them. Newton had gotten too close with Carson, which Carson didn't like because other guests had laughed along with him. Carson and Newton's fight turned out to be one of the few times his comedy went wrong. Newton's refusal to be the punchline of a joke and his willingness to talk to Carson about it caused a rift in their friendship that never fully healed. Dear Mr. Rogers, two of the biggest names in TV history were Johnny Carson and Fred Rogers, better known as Mr. Rogers. But their styles couldn't have been more different. Carson loved humor, being spontaneous, and having lively conversations. He was known for his quick wit, sarcasm and ability to make fun of guests. On the other hand, Fred Rogers was quiet, honest and avoided arguments or jokes that made fun of other people. It was often awkward for Rogers to be on The Tonight Show because of this big difference, and Carson allegedly didn't like having him as a guest. It was mostly because Carson couldn't use his normal comedic style around Rogers that he felt uncomfortable with her. Carson could tease, joke, and have fun with most of the guests, but Rogers' serious and calm attitude made that hard. For the most part, Rogers wasn't there to amuse. He was there to teach kids about being kind, understanding and learning. Millions of people respected how honest he was, but it didn't give Carson much room to use his trademark humor, which made the interviews feel slower and less lively than when other guests were on. Roger was also known as a saint-like character on children's TV, which made it hard for Carson to treat him like a normal guest. Too many jokes about him could make Carson look mean, which was something he didn't want to happen. Still, he wasn't able to have a long conversation with Rogers about fun things like he could with other famous people. During this part of the talk, Carson had a hard time keeping the energy up, which made the interview feel stilted and forced. Carson may not have liked having Rogers on because The Tonight Show was made for older people who watch late at night. It was just not the right tone for Rogers to be on the show, with his gentle talks about feelings and how kids grow up. Carson liked Rogers' work, but their different styles made the relationship awkward. Carson probably had a hard time with Rogers' shows, not because they didn't like each other personally, but because their TV personalities just didn't work well together. John Charlton. People loved Johnny Carson because he could make people feel comfortable by using humor and wit to start interesting talks, but it was hard for him to talk to some people, and Charlton Heston was one of them. Carson never said in public that he didn't like Heston, but there were a number of reasons why he was said to not enjoy having the famous actor on The Tonight Show. One of the big problems was that Heston was always serious and stiff. Heston had the gravitas of an old Hollywood leading man. He was known for his parts in epic movies, like Ben-Hur, The Ten Commandments, and Planet of the Apes. Heston was not always casual and serious, unlike many other stars who were happy to joke around and have fun. Carson liked things to be spontaneous and fun, so this stiffness probably made it hard for him to make an interesting conversation. In addition, Heston was known for talking too much and being too serious. Instead of having a quick back-and-forth conversation, he often gave long self-important answers when people asked about his movies, politics, or personal views. Carson liked people who could keep the tone light and be as funny as he was, and Heston's serious style didn't work well with that. Heston's strong political views may have been another source of stress. As a strong conservative and later as the head of the NRA, a well-known supporter of gun rights, Heston's views sometimes didn't agree with those of more moderate or liberal entertainment. Carson tried to stay out of political issues as much as possible, but he was known to make fun of both sides. It's possible that Heston didn't like being the target of jokes. Carson probably had a hard time with Heston as a guest because their styles didn't go well together. Carson wanted lively, funny conversations. Heston, on the other hand, brought a strong but too serious personality that didn't fit with The Tonight Show's late-night entertainment vibe. Even though Carson was always professional, it was said that interviews with Heston were more of a chore than a fun chat. Johnny Carson, played by Harry Belafonte, was the king of late-night TV. He was known for having a smooth, easygoing way of interviewing people, but some guests were hard for him. The famous singer, actor, and civil rights leader named Harry Belafonte was one of these guests. Carson admired Belafonte's skills and contributions to entertainment, but he was said to be a tough guest on The Tonight Show because of how serious he was, and how he talked about controversial topics. While Belafonte is known for hits like Day-O and the Banana Boat song, he was never just an artist. He was also a strong campaigner. Belafonte often led conversations about racial injustice, civil rights, and global humanitarian problems, while many other celebrity guests talked about their newest projects or made jokes. Even though these were important topics, they didn't always fit with The Tonight Show's style, which was to be a fun late-night show, where people could escape reality. Carson liked talks to be light-hearted and not too serious, so it was hard for him to handle conversations with Belafonte. Because of this, it was harder for him to add his trademark humor when guests were too serious or political. Carson was good at dealing with a lot of different types of people, but he wasn't known for having deep political conversations, especially about touchy issues like race and social justice, which Belafonte did a lot of. Also, Carson's viewers came to the show looking for laughs and fun, and a guest like Belafonte, who was very involved in politics, didn't always fit with the show's light-hearted tone. Carson was careful to keep serious and funny conversations in check. Guests who talked too much about serious topics could make the interview awkward or hard. Still, Carson was always professional, and Belafonte was a very well-known and respected person in the entertainment business. But because Carson liked entertainment and Belafonte liked activism, they didn't work well together. Carson apparently didn't like this dynamic as much as he did with other guests who played along with the show's comedic tone. It was said that Johnny Carson didn't like having some famous people on The Tonight Show, even though he was known for being charming and able to make almost any guest feel at ease. Chevy Chase was one of them. He was a comedy star who used to be on Saturday Night Live, and whose shows often made Carson mad. Carson didn't like having Chase on the show very much, because Chase has a reputation for being cocky. Chase became famous in the mid-1970s as the original Weekend Update host on Saturday Night Live. However, he quickly got a bad name in Hollywood for being cocky and full of himself. Chase often seemed smarter than Carson, which didn't go well with Carson's more relaxed but authoritative hosting style. This was different from many comics who came on The Tonight Show to play along with Carson's jokes. Another important reason was Chase's sense of humor, which was based on sarcasm, deadpan delivery, and sometimes being mean. Carson was known for having a sharp sense of humor, but he also made comedy feel warm and friendly. Chase was more blunt and self-centered, which threw off the show's rhythm, and made exchanges between the two feel awkward instead of funny. Carson and the guest could quickly turn the conversation into a tense or uncomfortable exchange, if they didn't have a fun and natural back and forth. This seemed to happen when Chase was in the chair. Carson was also known to be wary of younger comedians, who seemed too eager to take over as his replacement. As a rising star on Saturday Night Live, Chase was said to want to become the next big thing in late-night TV. He might have seen him as more of a rival than a welcome friend because of this, which would have made their interactions cold. Johnny Carson and Frank Sinatra were two of the biggest names in show business, but their meetings on The Tonight Show were sometimes tense. Sinatra was a famous guest, and his appearances got a lot of attention. However, Carson apparently didn't like having him on the show for a number of reasons. First, Sinatra was known for having a big personality, and being cocky sometimes, which could make him a difficult guest. He was known for being rude or flippant, especially when he didn't like what was going on. There were times when this attitude didn't go with Carson's more relaxed work attitude. Carson liked having control over his show, and wanted people who would respect the format and his job as host. Sinatra, on the other hand, liked being the center of attention, and didn't always follow the unspoken rules of late-night TV. One famous event happened when Sinatra walked on stage out of the blue during Carson's speech, and cut the host off in the middle of a joke. Carson handled the situation with the usual class and wit, but Sinatra's move was clearly an attempt to gain power, as he seemed to enjoy being the center of attention. Carson probably got irritated by these kinds of things because he was proud of keeping his show running smoothly. Sinatra's entourage and requests could also cause tension behind the scenes. He often showed up with a lot of friends and business associates, which could make it hard to put on the show. Carson liked to keep things under control, and was known for being very professional. He might have found these acts annoying or disrespectful. Even with these problems,
Carson saw Sinatra's star power and appreciated what he brought to the show. Sinatra's visits were always very anticipated by viewers, and Carson knew how important it was to have such a famous person on his show. However, you could feel the tension between the two guys. It shows how good of a host Carson is that he could handle these situations with fun and poise. However, Sinatra's diva-like behavior and occasional disregard for the show's structure made him a less than ideal guest in Carson's eyes. Bette Midler. Some of the most memorable moments in the history of The Tonight Show happened between Johnny Carson and Bette Midler. One of the most moving performances by Midler was on Carson's second-to-last show in 1992. Even though they got along well on TV and respected each other, there were signs that Carson didn't really enjoy having Midler as a guest. This stress came from personality clashes, what happened off-screen, and Midler's strong outspoken personality. Carson was known for being quiet and calm, and for being able to keep his show under control. He liked having people who could easily fit into the conversational style of the show, and who respected his job as host. On the other hand, Midler was a fiery, larger-than-life entertainer with a strong personality. Carson's calmer, more reserved style sometimes clashed with hers, causing an imbalance that could make their interactions feel uneven. This relationship often made for entertaining TV, but it may have made Carson feel a little awkward or overshadowed. Midler has talked about her relationship with Carson, and said that he was cold to her when they weren't on TV. She thought that Carson might have been scared or uneasy because she was sure of herself and spoke her mind. Midler was a strong, independent woman at a time when many guys in the entertainment business weren't used to seeing women be so direct. Carson was known for having traditional values, so it may have been hard for him to get to know her personally, even though he admired her work. Midler's acts on the show were also often emotional and show-stopping, which could take the attention away from Carson. She sang an emotional medley of songs while sitting on Carson's desk during her last show in 1992, which made him cry and became one of the most famous moments in late-night history. This was a beautiful and moving moment, but it also showed how Midler's presence could take over the show, making Carson feel like she wasn't important. Carson liked Midler's huge ability, and how entertaining she was on his show, but their personalities were different, and Midler's performances were intense, which may have made her a less comfortable guest for him. Their friendship was complicated, with both professional respect and small personal disagreements. It showed how hard it was for two strong personalities to get along in the world of late-night TV. George Carlin. Carson has asked a huge number of comedians to perform and talk on his show over the years. Carson hosted George Carlin a few times early in Carlin's career, but it became clear that their styles and ideas did not mix well, and Carson was said to dislike having Carlin as a guest later on. One thing that made things tense was how different their comedy styles and personalities were. Carson could make funny, edgy jokes, but most of the time he stuck to a popular, polished style that a lot of people liked. His show was meant to be fun for everyone, not just his audience. On the other hand, George Carlin became more and more famous for his rebellious view that was against the culture, especially in the 1970s. As Carlin's acts got more controversial, talking about things like religion, politics, and the hypocrisies of society, his humor started to go against the rules that Carson was trying to uphold on his show. Carson probably didn't want Carlin to be a regular guest because of this difference. Carson also liked it when guests followed the rules of the show and behaved properly, which was another factor. Carson may have wanted to be in charge of the tone of his show, but Carlin's attitude was unpredictable and pushed the limits. Carson would sometimes quietly stay away from guests who he thought slowed things down or went too far, even if the crowd liked them. Because Carlin was becoming more well-known as a counterculture hero, Carson may not have wanted to feature him because it would have been risky. In addition, Carson was a private, quiet person who valued efficiency. Carson might not have connected with Carlin's unique style and changing character, especially as he moved away from the clean-cut comedian image he had in the beginning of his career. Carlin was a great comedian, but Carson's vision for The Tonight Show did not fit with Carlin's changing style of humor and personality. As a result, their working relationship cooled down. Hey Shelley Winters. The Oscar-winning actress Shelley Winters was one of the few guests who seemed to test Carson's patience and make him look uncomfortable when she came on. With time, it became clear that Carson did not like having Winters on his show. Their relationship was tense and uncertain most of the time. One big reason Carson was said to not like Winters was that she was outspoken and hard to guess. Winters was known for being rude, having strong opinions, and not being afraid to take over talks. She talked over Carson, questioned his answers, or went off topic a lot, which slowed down the show. Because Carson was known for being in charge and making talks go smoothly, it must have been annoying to deal with a guest who didn't follow the unspoken rules of late-night TV manners. Carson's carefully planned approach might not have worked well with her tendency to steal the show. Even though Winters was known for being unreliable and hostile, her public appearances caused a lot of stress. One famous time, she allegedly took off a shoe and gave it to Carson during an interview, making him look irritated. Some watchers found Carson's antics funny, but he probably got a bad grade on them because he liked guests who were professional and didn't take away from his humor. Winters' ridiculously big attitude might have been hard for Carson to handle during a live show. Carson's personality, which was a mix of Midwestern reserve and sharp wit, also didn't fit with Winters' more outgoing and flashy personality. Carson could get into a friendly fight with a guest, but Winters' confidence often went too far and made Carson feel uneasy. Their interactions weren't always fun and games, which may have been one reason Carson didn't want to ask her back often. In the end, Shelley Winters' strong personality and unpredictable behavior made her a tough guest for Johnny Carson. He liked talks that were calm and controlled, but she often caused chaos on stage. Tom Snyder, the mysterious and opinionated TV host best known for his own late-night show Tomorrow, was another famous person Carson was said to not enjoy having. Snyder and Carson were both regulars on late-night TV, but their attitudes and ways of doing TV were very different. This made things awkward when Snyder went on The Tonight Show. Snyder's over-the-top personality and tendency to take over talks were major sources of tension. Snyder was a skilled reporter in his own right, and his intense, sometimes hostile style made him stand out. When he was a guest on Carson's show, he often controlled the conversation, talking for a long time, and sometimes making Carson look bad. Carson was more relaxed and funny, so Snyder's presence was probably too much for Carson to handle. Snyder may not have been able or ready to respect Carson as the host, which may have caused problems between the two. Carson may not have liked Snyder's tendency to brag about himself and his sometimes rude behavior. Carson liked interviewees who were amused by his jokes and let him run the show. Snyder, on the other hand, liked to talk a lot about himself or his own show, which could throw off the balance of a normal Carson discussion. Carson probably didn't like this relationship because he liked a more collaborative and conversational tone. Their different personalities may have been another reason. Carson was more of a team player and conversationalist. Their different attitudes and ways of doing late-night TV may have naturally caused a rift. Carson may have seen Snyder as a competition in some ways too, since Snyder hosted Tomorrow right after Tonight on NBC for many years, says Deborah. Johnny Carson was famous for being able to talk to a lot of different kinds of people, from comedians to artists to famous people from different cultures, but he was said to have been upset or frustrated by some guests, and Saza Gabor was one of them. The actor and socialite, born in Hungary, and known for her flashy lifestyle and personality, often clashed with Carson's more reserved and sarcastic style, which made her a difficult guest for him to host. Gabor's tendency to take over talks was a big source of tension between Carson and Gabor. Gabor was famous for having a quick mind, acting like she was bigger than life, and talking non-stop about her money, relationships, and fancy life. Some people found this funny, but Carson often didn't have a chance to steer the talk or add his trademark humor. Carson liked having people who could talk with him and laugh at his subtle jokes. Gabor, on the other hand, told too many stories about herself, which slowed down the show and annoyed Carson. Some people think Carson didn't like Gabor's showy and diva-like act. She often lived up to her image as a strange and beautiful lady, which could come off as fake or over the top. Carson liked things to be real, and could spot fakeness right away, so her actions probably annoyed him. Also, Gabor's habit of flirting too much with male hosts, like Carson, might have made him feel awkward, since he liked to keep the tone of his talks light and professional, rather than getting too personal. Gabor may not have been aware of her own problems. Carson was good at making fun of his guests in a subtle way. He often did this to calm them down or bring out their flaws. However, Gabor couldn't or wouldn't laugh at herself, so these clever moments of interaction often fell flat. causing a rift between the two. In the end, Saza Gabor was a difficult guest, because she was bossy, behaved like a diva, and couldn't match Carson's sense of fun. People might find her visits entertaining, but they probably made Carson irritable, and threw off the balance he worked hard to keep on The Tonight Show. Norman Mailer was known for having strong ideas, acting aggressively, and wanting to start arguments. When he went on Carson's show, Mailer often caused problems, and Carson was said to dislike having him on. One of the main reasons Carson didn't like Mailer was that the author was usually argumentative and hostile. Mailer loved to argue with people intellectually, and he was known for pushing the limits in interviews, where he would often challenge the interviewer, or steer the talk into awkward territory. Carson was more of a chatty and funny person, so Mailer's hostile tone probably got old for Carson, and ruined the fun atmosphere of The Tonight Show. Carson liked funny banter more than turning interviews into arguments, which Mailer liked to do a lot. Another problem was that Mailer liked to take over talks. Carson was great at running interviews, making sure there was a good mix of fun, stories, and interesting conversation. Mailer, on the other hand, often stole the show by talking for a long time, and not letting Carson speak or change the subject. This might have irritated Carson, who liked having people who could work together and have interesting conversations. Mailer also had a reputation for being controversial before he met him. Mailer was known for being honest about his feelings on politics, culture, and gender. He often wrote about controversial topics that could turn people off or make for awkward situations. Carson planned his show to appeal to a wide range of people, so Mailer's lack of reliability and often rude behavior were probably problems for him. Finally, Carson was quiet, which was very different from Mailer's cockiness and intellectual arrogance. It was funny when Carson had to deal with tough guests, but Mailer's anger and refusal to fit in with the show's lighter mood probably made him annoying. In the end, Johnny Carson's vision for The Tonight Show was met with Norman Mailer's combative personality, dominant presence, and tendency to be controversial. This made him one of Carson's least favorite guests. Tony Curtis. Curtis was clearly a big star and an interesting person, but Carson didn't always like the way he behaved and talked during interviews. This made his appearances tense for the host. It was said that Carson didn't like having Tony Curtis on the show because the actor liked to take over talks. Curtis, who was full of energy and self-assurance, often took over interviews by telling long, boring stories about his job, his personal life, or funny Hollywood stories. Even though these stories were sometimes funny, Carson often didn't have a chance to lead the talk or add his own unique humor. Carson liked it when his guests, and he had a good mix of conversation, so Curtis's constant attention must have been annoying to Carson. Curtis's big personality and tendency to brag about himself clashed with Carson's quiet and funny personality. Curtis seemed too eager to remind people of how famous he was, and how much he had done, which could throw off the flow of the show. Carson liked it when his guests were self-aware and ready to make fun of themselves, so Curtis's acting like she was bigger than life might have annoyed Carson.